There are lots of ideas on how to do this, but it has to be part of a coordinated.
Innovative and determined, he is a man with a mind to transform Africa's vast resources.
I came to realize that there's a new tool that could actually empower Africans to diversify their food base.
His mission is to find a scientific solution to the continent's agricultural problems.
And the purpose for conservation is so that future generations can benefit from those crops.
This week on African Voices, we meet the esteemed author, professor, and conservationist Calestous Juma. With a sunny disposition and a shock of white hair, Calestous Juma is hard to miss. A beloved professor at Harvard University, he's also one of the most recognizable voices in biotechnology and sustainable development. For 3 decades, this Kenyan-born scholar has been raising the profile and practicality of biotechnology. But his love and passion for science was inspired by his local fields.
I was interested in the conservation of African varieties of crops, particularly. I was studying fruits and vegetables of the slopes of Mount Elgon in Western Kenya. And I started to run into older people who had collected seeds of fruits and vegetables, mostly fruits, that had disappeared. And some of them explained to me that those fruits have disappeared because the area dried up. And they would pose a question to me and say, you scientists, are you able to make these fruits grow in places where there is less water? So that's what got me interested in genetic modification, because answering that question couldn't be done using conventional methods of breeding. You actually needed to find traits for drought tolerance, because you're going to be growing these same crops in places where there is no water. These are crops that used to grow along rivers. And as I started to think about the potential for genomics, and that was in the late 80s.
At the time, revolutionary work was already underway in genetic engineering.
What scientists found out exactly 30 years ago and demonstrated scientifically is that you can transfer those traits from one plant to another, and what that plant was doing can now be done by a new plant. So if a plant was resistant to, say, high temperatures, and if you transfer those genes to another plant, that plant also becomes resistant to high temperatures. And that started to open up new industries, because you could then start to design organisms to adapt to new places. And that started to create a basis for basically building up new industries. And that's what has happened primarily in agriculture.
How transformative can biotechnology and its applications be in Africa?
Highly transformative, because African agriculture is stagnated over the years. One of the reasons is by being in the tropics, farmers encounter so many different challenges: pests, drought, floods, decline nutrients. And what is happening with this new technology is that you can now empower plants to resist pests. And that has huge implications for agriculture, because the farmers don't have to buy pesticides, many of which are in fact toxic. Some are in fact carcinogenic. And so you end up growing crops at a lower price, but also reducing the negative impacts of using chemicals. And this is being done quite in a number of African countries.
This path of research led him to international acclaim. In 1989, he authored The Gene Hunters, which set him apart in his field.
I published my book 7 years before the commercial release of genetically modified crops in the United States. But my motivation came from local people wanting scientific solutions to their problems. That's what motivated. I came from environmental conservation. I had been mentored by the late Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai on conservation. That was my interest. And the purpose for conservation is so that future generations can benefit from those crops That's what motivation for conservation was about. And then I came to realize that there's a new tool that could actually empower Africans to diversify their food base. Not only do that, but be able to resurrect crops that had disappeared or adapt their traditional crops to new conditions.
One country that's benefited from the use of genetically modified crops is Burkina Faso. Ranked 183 of 187 countries and territories on the Human Development Index, the West African nation is also one of the world's poorest. For a country heavily reliant on growing cotton, or white gold as the locals call it, the introduction of GM crops in the past decade has been completely transformative.
This is a country where the cotton industry had virtually collapsed because pests had developed resistance to all known pesticides. And the current president came in and said there's a new technology we can use that can help us to revive the industry. So the first application of it was reviving cotton in areas where the industry had collapsed. But that has also opened up possibilities for new farmers who have come in and have expanded cotton production. And we've seen significant improvements in the income of the cotton farmers. The country has been able to see the prospects of reviving its agriculture beyond cotton to a point where they are now even thinking about establishing a regional cotton university to help train people in all aspects of industrial activities associated with cotton, all the way from agronomy to basically manufacturing to textiles. So Burkina Faso is a good example of how this could become really transformational for all types of farmers, both large-scale farmers and small-scale farmers.
I wouldn't have thought Burkina Faso was spearheading the revolution in biotechnology in Africa. What is it that makes that so? Is it, again, a commitment of leadership?
Leadership was very important in the case of Burkina Faso because the Economic Commission of West African States, ECOWAS, had adopted a decision basically imposing a moratorium on the cultivation of genetically modified crops on the assumption that they will be catastrophic for the environment. And the leadership of Burkina Faso went to ECOWAS and said, if we are not allowed to adopt this technology, which is essential for our revival of agricultural system, we are going to withdraw from ECOWAS. And it was that pressure that led ECOWAS to exempt Burkina Faso from these restrictions. And Burkina Faso moved on to start growing GM cotton. So leadership is absolutely important in this respect.
What can lure leaders to invest more in biotechnology beyond their own commitment?
Leaders have to be responsive to the needs of the population. And that's what happened in Burkina Faso. We had a leader who came to power and was under enormous pressure to improve the living conditions of the people, and agriculture is the starting point.
Juma hopes it can be a new beginning for a troubled industry. Coming up, the inspiration that drives Juma to take on some of the continent's biggest problems. Africa is a continent reliant on land. Between 70 and 80% of its population works in agriculture. Genetic engineering can be used to produce healthy crops amidst recurrent problems, including pests, disease, and drought. But to many small farmers, biotechnology is seen as a threat. What about subsistence farmers? Because much of the agriculture is generated by subsistence farmers on a small scale throughout the continent. Does biotechnology undermine them?
I don't think so, because if you look at the global adoption of biotechnology, in fact, nearly 80 to 90% of the use of some of these techniques is by small-scale farmers. If you look at cotton production in China and India, and to some degree South Africa, is by small-scale farmers. This technology is scale neutral. It's the challenge of the farmers to decide whether they're going to use it on a small scale or on a large scale. The same technology is used in the US on a large scale because they have large farms. In China, it's being used on small farms. There are not large farms in China. So it's scale neutral.
Are there any environmental fallouts to using biotechnology? Does it damage the environment?
The evidence, in fact, is starting to show that in the case of pest control, it's reducing the use of chemicals that would normally affect the environment. So there we can see benefits to the environment accruing from the use of this technology. We've also seen other examples where the technology allows farmers to grow crops without having to plow the land, because one of the reasons you plow is to be able to control weeds.
Right.
And if you have weed or a herbicide-tolerant crops, you can then grow your crops without having to weed, without having to plow the land. And that means that you end up having more carbon conserved in the soil than you would under normal farming practices.
How would a subsistence farmer in a small village or a small area learn biotechnology tools and to operate? Is there a wide educational push, or I mean, how does it actually work when it comes down to the individual farmer level?
To the individual farmer, the technology is embodied in the seed. So the traits are embodied in the seed. And if you go to a farmer and say, here is a seed that would allow you to grow cotton without applying pesticides or applying less pesticides, that's the information that the farmer is looking for. And the second thing that the farmer will think about is how much does the seed cost. In some cases, the seed may cost more than the conventional seed.
Right.
And so the farmer has to do the calculation of paying a little more for the seed and getting a high yield because they will reduce the use of pesticides. And most critics tend to focus on the increased price for the seed, but are silent about the fact that the farmer is no longer spraying 12 times a year, is only spraying maybe 2 or 3 times a year.
What kind of structures need to be in place for biotechnology to flourish in Africa?
I think the most important is to invest more in agriculture so that agriculture is functioning. In that if your agriculture isn't functioning, you can't use new techniques like biotechnology, because you need to get those traits and put them in existing crops. And if you are not growing those crops in the first place, you won't have the benefit of this new technology. Again, you can use the mobile phone analogy, which is that if you don't have a mobile infrastructure, you can't use the new SIM cards or new services provided by say, text messaging. That's really the analogy here, in that you need the infrastructure first. And so the first step for African countries is to start investing seriously in agriculture. And the good news is that this is happening. We are starting to see African presidents taking leadership and coordinating agricultural investments, which basically means that they can revive agriculture. And if they do, they will be able then to use these emerging technologies.
Just recently,
A message that has led Juma all over the world, from heading projects at the United Nations to working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He was recently named by New Africa magazine as one of Africa's most influential people. Despite all the accolades and honors, he says it's the challenge that drives his work.
I think what excites me is this interesting development where we have dramatic expansion of global challenges, environmental challenges, greater population. But hidden in that is also enormous creativity on the part of the global population, particularly among young people. And what excites me is that almost for every problem, there are young people who are focused on finding those problems, solutions to those problems. I've observed that, in fact, there's even a greater awareness of global challenges among high school kids. So I'm spending part of my time, in fact, introducing some of these principles on the role of engineering in solving global problems to high school kids. So we have a kind of an interesting situation where you have a greater challenges, but also greater interest in responding to those challenges. So the instinct of human beings to be more creative in face of challenges is something that excites me and gets me feeling optimistic about the future.
I'm just wondering, you're doing so much and wanting biotechnology so much to influence Africa, to transform agriculture. What is it about the work in biotechnology that you've done has transformed you?
I think what has transformed me is that I came in through conservation, being interested in environmental conservation. And then realizing that, in fact, what we are trying to conserve is also the foundation for renewing African economies. That African economies are built around, in fact, living organisms, whether it's plants, fisheries, animals. That resource, which we're thinking about purely for conservation purposes, is also the foundation for new industries. That means you can start to bring conservation and development together. And that is a different way of thinking about it, because most environmentalists, until recently, always argued that the way to protect the environment is to slow down development. And I'm seeing this as really one area, which is conservation and development.
Coming up, fighting his critics with a smile, Calestous Juma says you have to stay positive. Bringing new ideas and technology to Africa is no easy task. Despite his critics, Calestous Juma is optimistic. Is one of the issues or obstacles or positive aspects, how you choose to see it, the fact that this industry in much of the African continent is mostly donor funded?
Part of the concern has been that when the technology was initially developed, it was owned and controlled by large corporations. And that started to create a constituency of people who were hostile to large corporations. And those people are hostile to biotechnology because they make an association between biotechnology and large corporations. Mm-hmm. Over time, many of the original patents that were owned by large corporations have expired. This knowledge is in the public domain. And so that's where we see the potential for Africa moving in as a latecomer, being able to harness technology that has always been there. But by being a latecomer, you have a huge advantage in that you can learn from the front runners, you can avoid the mistakes that have been made by others. And that's where Africa has a huge advantage as a latecomer, in that it doesn't have to repeat the mistakes others have actually made in the past. But there's a lot more knowledge available in the public domain today than there was when companies like Monsanto and Syngenta were actually moving into this field. Many organisms have already been sequenced in that we know what the genetic information codes for. Nearly 5,000 different organisms have now been decoded. And that those organisms offer developing countries, African countries in particular, to be able to identify the traits that may be relevant for their problems. This is possible now, wasn't possible 20 years ago.
What would you say to young Africans, young aspiring scientists, molecular biologists on the continent who want to get more involved in biotechnology and see the exciting landscape that's evolving and emerging? What would your message be to people like that? You know, because many travel abroad to gain those expertise and they don't come back.
My message to young Africans is to look at Asia 40 years ago. When microelectronics was emerging as a field, young Asians went to study electronic engineering because that was the field of the future. Today, the field of the future is genomics. Therefore, studying genetic engineering will do for Africa what microelectronic engineering did for Asian countries. And the new jobs of the future are going to be at that intersection between biology and engineering. And genetic engineering is not called genetic engineering for nothing. It's actually a branch of engineering. That's what I would tell young Africans, that's where the future lies.
It's not just about looking forward, but also up. More African leaders than ever are actively bringing in new technology to their people. And as you travel through the continent, are you seeing your peers, other people around you that support the kind of things that you're talking about? Is there as much optimism about biotechnology and its various applications in Africa as the way you have it?
Yes, I can do this by kind of two reference points. 2005, I prepared a report for Kofi Annan on innovation for development and started to have discussions with leaders, mainly African leaders. There were very few of them then that were interested in the subject. Today is a very different atmosphere, in that you have champions of the technology. We have champions of agriculture who did not exist 5, 6, 7 years ago. We have leaders like the president of Tanzania who are very focused in mobilizing other African presidents to create consortia to start engaging with the private companies on how to increase investment on the African continent. Part of that is overall agricultural investment, but part of it is, in fact, investment in biotechnology. This didn't exist 5 years ago. I haven't seen that level of leadership being really articulated in the area of agriculture. But even more interestingly, we are seeing a change in the character of leadership, in that 7 years ago, there were very few African leaders who had a technical background. Last year, 6 African countries elected engineers for president, and that's Tunisia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Somalia, Angola, and Senegal.
That's fantastic.
Right. Niger, Eritrea have engineers for president. Nigeria has a president who has a PhD in fisheries. And so we're starting to see the emergence of a new crop of leaders who understand this issue, so you can start to have a conversation.
What do you think is the single most important message that you feel that people around the world who are learning about this for the first time and its significance and transformative nature of biotechnology on the African continent should really walk away with?
I think the first step is to step back from dogma, because we've had a lot of debates that have been very dogmatic, whether it's biotechnology versus organic farming. This is actually not helpful because these techniques apply in both fields. So we need a certain level of open-mindedness, being open to the future. Secondly, not to try to tell Africans what you think is good for them. We've had very bad news and very bad history on biotechnology between Europe and Africa, where Europe's concern is to reduce production. Africa's concern is to increase production. Africans know what they would like to do, and they would like to be given just a little bit of space to experiment and try out things on their own. Give Africans a chance to articulate their needs.